And as a result, we must be able to ensure that anything that comes into the organization is something that is of quality. Therefore, what we need to understand there is that goods receiving is a function of checking items delivered to the business, either coming in as new stock or as new supplies. So anything that is coming into the organization must be received. And the essence of receiving is to check whether the items coming into the organization are of quality, they are of good condition, and their quantity is according to what you had ordered for later. Then the other thing is also to ensure that you're able to allocate space of those items in the store. And that is the essence of why is it important? Why is it important? Number one, it is important because it helps you to ascertain that anything that is coming into the organization is of good quality. It also helps you to identify the defective items that come into the organization. And when you talk about receiving, we have various sources of items that come into the organization. One of them is the external suppliers. External suppliers, items can also come from the production section. Then the other one is central store. If you're working on an impressed system, the central store, when you're working on an impressed system. Then what are some of the considerations you need to do before you unload materials? Number one, you need to check if the consignee, sometimes materials are bought to the wrong location, especially if the address of the document is not clear. So you might find what you are receiving in the organization is from another location, and that can be very, very tricky. Therefore, it is always important to check before you unload the materials. Number two is if the goods are for a particular delivery point. Many large organizations have many locations where delivery might take place. So we have those big branches that have various branches. We have big companies that have various branches. Sometimes it becomes difficult when you load the materials, then you find that they are not for that location. So it is always important to check the delivery point before you unload. Then we have those materials that are hazardous, Hazardous materials are materials that are harmful. They are harmful to the people who are working. They are harmful to the people who are working in the store. So it is always important to check those items. And at the end of the day, you'll be able to know where they are supposed to be taken. You also need to label them as one of the standard practices of ensuring that those items are safe and safety precautions must be taken. The other thing is if there is a possibility of avoiding double handling. So sometimes you realize that some of those items are required directly to the production. So instead of offloading them in the receiving area, you can decide to take them direct to the production. Hello, are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me? So we can continue. Before you unload materials. Then the other one is the appropriate loading method that you need to use. So different materials require different. So different methods require different materials require different methods of unloading. Therefore, before you unload, you need to consider some of those methods that are critical. Then we have some various documents that are critical when you are receiving items. Number one is the delivery note, which is a document that is used to ascertain that goods have been delivered. Then we have the issuing note. This is an issue note against materials. And before you issue, you need to identify the goods requisition note so that you ascertain that indeed they were authorized. Then you have the daily production sheet. This is a document that shows that production is supposed to take place. Then we can also talk about the receiving procedure. And the first step of the receiving procedure is to unload and check for consignment. So before items are delivered to your location, you need to unload those items and check if those consignments are for that location. Number two, you need to unpack and inspect. Unpack and inspect. So here, basically, you are trying to ascertain if those items are really for that location. By unpacking and inspecting them, you are checking if the items are in good quality, if the items are in good quantity, and basically you are checking whether the items have damages or not. Then we also talk about completing the receiving report. Once the goods are in good condition, you must be able to complete the receiving report. Then after completing the receiving report, then the invoices are taken for payment. Then the items also must be taken for storage or delivery to the users. So you are taking them to the users or to the store, are waiting for the customers. Then we shall also talk about the inspection of materials. So inspection is very, very critical in any organization. And inspecting now is checking on the quality of those items. Basically, you are trying to check whether the materials are in the required quality and quantity. So we have various methods that you will use when you're inspecting those materials. Number one is physical counting. Physical counting. So the other thing we will talk about today is the other method is physical checking, where you check for those items to ascertain whether they have quality issues. Then we also talk about practical tests, where you do some tests on those items. We shall also talk about chemical analysis in case you receive items that require that analysis. For example, when you're testing drugs and industrial chemicals. You can also talk about measuring and weighing. And here we are talking about items like meat, for example. When you are inspecting meat, you are supposed to weigh the meat or any vegetable produce. This is because at the end of the day, you realize that they need to be weighed. Then the other thing is feeling. There are some items that must be felt, like when you're buying a carpet, for example, you need to feel those items to ascertain whether the items are of good quality. Then we also talk about the issue of smelling. We have those items that need to be smelled. For example, when you're buying perfume, you need to smell those items to ascertain whether those items are of good quality. Then we can also talk about the systems of inspecting. We have two major systems of inspecting. Number one is the 100% system. In the 100% system, you check items, all the items that you are going to receive. You check those items one by one until you finish. Then we also talk about, this is one of the accurate methods that is used because it is also reliable because you're checking items one by one. But one of the disadvantages of these items is that it is very, very, very slow compared to the sampling inspection. And in case of large quantity consignment, all the materials must be inspected. Number two, it's very costly because it requires members, stationaries, and labor also. Then you can talk about increased workload on the receiving staffs. You realize those people are really working so hard. And at the end of the day, it leads to various issues when it comes to the workload. So we are talking about sampling method, and we are saying that sampling method is very, very important in any organization. Where sampling method is used, you basically pick items at random, and we are trying to inspect those items. And those items that have been picked will be a representative of the rest of the consignment. So what are some of the circumstances? Number one, we said where the materials to be inspected have been received in large quantities. So if those items are received in large quantities, so that you want to save on time, you can decide to use the sampling method. Number two, where the materials are urgently required and there is no time to inspect them. So we have those items that are required urgently and you really don't have time or the luxury of time to inspect them. So you can decide to use that method. Then where the company wants to reduce the cost of inspection and sampling is economical. So where the organization wants to reduce on cost, they might decide to use that method. Then the other thing is where the materials being inspected are homogeneous. Basically, they are similar in nature. So you can decide to use this method. And the other one is where the cost associated with accepting a defective material can be overlooked because those items do not form part of the final product. Then we can talk about where the inspection of material involves destructive tests to determine their components and sampling. Therefore, it will lead to minimization of loss associated with the distractions. So we have those chemicals that are very critical. Therefore, it requires you to sample a few because when you sample all of them, it might lead to losses to the organization. So what are some of the reasons that may call for rejections of material? Number one, where the material received have defects or damages. So you cannot be able to receive materials that are damaged. Therefore, you require to reject those materials. Number two, where the materials have been delivered later or earlier than required. So if you didn't expect those materials to be received earlier, you might end up rejecting those materials from coming into your organization. Then the other thing is where the materials are not required in the right quantity. So you can decide to reject those materials. So sometimes materials can be received in shortage as a result of the following reasons. Number one, disappearance during transit as a result of theft. Then we have packing of less quantity, either by mistake or intentionally by the supplier. And lastly, some materials, e.g. liquid, may be reduced because of evaporation or exposure to the environment. Then what are some of the factors that you need to consider? Some of the factors that you need to consider when inspecting materials. Number one is adequate inspection equipment depending on the nature of materials. So you need to have materials, you need to have inspection equipment during inspection to make the process very easy. Number two is adequate space must be provided. Adequate space must be provided to enhance the movement of staffs and materials in the warehouse. Then you also need to provide a marshalling area. So where items are assembled for inspection. Then security facilities should be provided to reduce any losses that may occur. So you need to have security facilities. Then you can't forget documentation, which is very critical. You also need to have documentation. Then the last factor is enough and right staff to carry out the receiving activities. So you need to have the relevant staffs who have the experience to do that work. So any question?